Hello and welcome to another of the Nautical Institute technical webinars. I am David Petraco with the Nautical Institute's headquarters in London, and I'm joined here by a truly international panel. We have James from the UK, Johan from lovely Sweden, Julia from the UK, Neil from a very early morning in Virginia, and Captain Chawla from Hong Kong. So welcome everybody. Before we start, just a little bit of introduction. I hope everybody's aware of the Nautical Institute and what we do, but if not, we are an international professional body, and our main role is to help our members with professional development. We do this by sharing information and best practices. We represent our members at forums like the IMO and IALA and GlobalMet. And the reason we do this is that we feel that professionals, people who make an effort for continuous learning, we think they make better decisions. And those decisions may be for safety, those decisions may be for commercial effectiveness, they may even be for career development, but they make better decisions. So one of the big questions always is, how can technology, how can knowing about technology, how can utilizing technology in the right way help people make better decisions? So we have a great team here from Wartsila who are going to help us answer that question. Before we get there, this is an interactive session, and you can participate not with your camera or your microphone, but through text. So you have a little control panel on the upper right-hand side. When that's expanded, there's an area for asking a question. You can type in your question, make sure you press the send button. There are some handouts. All the slides from today are available as handouts. So if there's a lot of information on in the next hour and a half, but it's all downloadable. So feel free to do that. We will be doing a poll, and that poll is to make sure that you're all awake and paying attention. So you will be judged on your answers. But when the poll comes up, click the answers you want. You can choose more than one answer and then press submit. And Julia will be looking after that for us. After the session, there will be a pop-up survey. Would appreciate if you took part in that survey. It only takes 2 to 3 minutes, but it helps us improve our performance. About 2 to 3 hours after the event, you will get a thank you for attending email. Within that email, there will be a link to a personalized CPD certificate. So you're welcome to that. The recording of this webinar is being recorded, both the presentations and the Q&A afterwards, and that recording will be available on our YouTube channel probably by sometime tomorrow. So feel free to share that with your friends and colleagues. And you are not alone. There are probably a little bit more than that, but about 550 registrants at the moment. So when you write in for your question, please be as succinct as possible. It will really help me filter those out. So on to the main event. Before we introduce the team, I'd like to welcome Captain Pradeep Chawla, who is a long-term fellow of the Nautical Institute, a former vice president of the Nautical Institute. He is the director of quality and training at Anglo Eastern, and I think that's such a clever move to join quality and training. Anglo Eastern have about 650 ships and nearly 30,000 seafarers that they're responsible for training. Pradeep is also the chairman of GlobalMet, which is the Training and Education Association internationally. So he knows a thing or two about training, and he will be here to participate in our debates. We also have a team from Wartsila, and I will introduce Neil Bennett, who is the Director of Global Simulation Sales, and he will be the ringmaster for the next hour and introduce his team. So Neil, thank you ever so much for getting up early and participating with us.
No problem at all. Very happy to be here. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, just to introduce the team on the call today. So with us is Johan Ekval. Johan is the director of our simulation solutions for navigation simulators, operating from Gothenburg, Sweden. James Lee, who is business development and solutions manager with a slant towards the digital learning and those technologies. And also here, who you saw, she switched off her camera now, which is Julia Ponomareva, who is from our PR and marketing team. There she is. She's usually hidden in the background, but today we forced her to switch her camera on. She'll be making sure everything runs perfectly smoothly throughout the webinar. Thank you, Julia. Okay, so let's get started. Theme of our webinar is digital learning technologies, adapting to the pandemic using these digital learning technologies. I want to start by just asking a few questions to the panelists here about the effects of the pandemic in the way that their training has been affected. Captain Chawla, obviously it's been a fairly tough, challenging year with crew strandings and a different operational environment, but focusing specifically on the maritime training side, how has the pandemic affected Anglo Eastern, and how have you had to adapt to that? You are muted. That's $5.
I'm used to being married for a long time, so it's difficult to be unmuted. Yes, for 2020, I would say like there's only one way to describe what happened in 2020. It's all, oh my God, would be what the youngsters would say. Yeah. How did it impact our operations? Besides the fact that we are struggling to get seafarers off the ships and to put them on the ships, the world of training got disrupted. So basically the training centers have been off in most of the countries for nearly 6 months now. Most of the countries have not allowed classroom teaching to happen for social distancing reasons. And the whole world has sort of gone from real to virtual. And I think there is no option for anyone in the industry now to not consider adopting new ways of doing everything, not just training. And I think those who adopt technology, it's a matter of survival now. And again, not just for training. And those who at the same time forget that it is still a human factor and a human business, I think will also perish in 2021. And the whole competition around everything has increased dramatically. So adopting new technology for training is a survival requirement now, I think, for any ship management company. And that's where we are, that we are eagerly adopting, or rather we were already an early adopter of technology even before, but now that's taken on a new meaning even for us. That would be my comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Johan, similar question. You're obviously dealing with a lot of training centers around the world. I know when this all started to happen in February, March of this year, we received a lot of input, questions, comments, and so on. But can you, I guess from a bit more of a technical perspective, what did you see and what did you see happening in the training centers to try to adapt?
Yeah, I mean, when it became obvious for everyone that the classrooms and simulators were basically off limits, as Pradeep said there, we saw a lot of initiatives and creativity among the training centers, how to actually resume the planned training. And schools were connecting the classroom simulators to the internet through VPN connections and accessing them through TeamViewer or similar applications. And this, of course, solved the first 1 or 2 or 3 sessions or so. But of course, this is not a scalable solution. It's not an infrastructure that is built for distributing training online. But yeah, it's a very manual process, and but it was a pragmatic solution for, but it showed the industry, showed us that the industry is behind when it comes to the embracement of the digital learning. Even if we have talked about this for probably 10 years, we had some cloud initiatives going, but it hasn't really lifted off, right? So yeah, we basically stood there without the possibility to proceed training and at the same time apply social distancing. So yeah, that was.
Yeah. James, you're relatively new to Maritime, having joined us recently, but you have been involved in the wider education and corporate learning businesses for many years. Want to expand the discussion a little bit outside of Maritime, because we're really a small part of a much larger education business around the world. What were some of the effects on the wider education market, and what happened there outside of our little sphere?
Yeah, it's a great question, Neil, and I'll try to cut through the noise, because there's been a lot of buzz around the complete transfer of learning online. But from a supply side perspective, on the corporate side, the company I used to work for, we were providing learning management systems and digital learning across multiple sectors. And our clients, we saw increase and we had to add service space. We saw anywhere from 30 to 800% increase in online time. And it was interesting, from those enterprise customers, what the users were looking for was not just boosting what they were already learning, they were actively trying to seek out problem-solving learning online. So things like very specific competencies, very specific resilience-based training, or recertification as people sharpen their skills as they worry about their jobs. There's an interesting perspective as well from the consumer learning online. And there's some great companies out there that many people, including, I guess, our seafarers, would use, things like Udemy and Coursera and LinkedIn Learning, and their statistics are quite remarkable. And I took some notes this morning. So Udemy, which is a skills platform, had around 425% increase in enrollments in March. Khan Academy, which is an online teaching resource for K through 12, they went from delivering 30 million minutes of learning a month to 100 million minutes. And effectively, LinkedIn Learning, which is something I use, went from a base to a 300% increase. So effectively, 1.8 billion people from kindergarten through to higher education, excluding corporates, left the classroom, and many of them transfer their learning online. And there's a lot of different ways they can do it. So summary is, digital learning kind of went from a nice to have, despite me on the supply side saying it was a must have, to very much a must have. And we all had to scramble to adjust and adapt to the new normal.
Yeah, well, I'd like to take that a little bit further, because there's some very interesting numbers there, and I think Maritime, as part of this wider education world, it is interesting to see where that business is and how much e-learning has been actually adopted already. So if I can ask you to perhaps share your screen, Julia will do the magic there. And so James is going to give us a short presentation about some of the wider trends in education and training. Over to you, James.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so I'm going to look at to give some insight and some help as we sort of think about the future of digital learning and the impacts of the pandemic, and then some of the opportunities for Maritime. I'll touch upon some of the things that are happening in both the trends in corporate and skills and education sector. Try to cut through some of the buzzwords, because there's a lot of buzz and hype, some of which will make us all roll our eyes a bit. And I'm going to throw up some charts and numbers, but I'll try to sort of hone in and see what we can learn from it. I guess the summary to say is, this year we've had a massive shift. We've had a massive shift online in global L&D, and we've had a massive shift in how people consume learning. I think there's probably very few of us that haven't had some opportunity to try to improve or learn online in the last year. So we'll have a look at where we're going, and also it's important to look back and where we've been. And I'm a big believer in learning from history. This is a bit of a linear timeline. It's not a history lesson, but we're effectively well into what's called the fourth industrial revolution, which is where we've progressed from water and steam mechanics through to mass production of electricity, the manufacturing and widespread use of electronics and IT system, into all these fancy buzzwords like Internet of Things and AI. And what's interesting is if you look below this timeline, we're talking here about education. So education as a formal structured way of imparting skills changed very little since the beginning of the first industrial revolution, where we have what any teachers amongst us, I used to be one, we refer to as chalk and talk. So we recite and we impart knowledge and we test and assess. Of course, within that, in maritime in particular, but in most skills industries, we've got apprenticeships and traineeships, going away to sea, on-the-job training. So that effectively remained unchanged. There was some influences from technology, as processing power and manufacturing meant that IT equipment became cheaper. So, the Apple computers and IBM mainframes started to appear in universities in particular, but also in training institutions and schools in the 70s and 80s. But it wasn't really, mainly was the cost of entry. It really wasn't a thing that was hugely uptaken. The internet arrived in the 90s. I remember having the internet at university in the 90s with the big telephone. It was an amazing thing to dial into the Library of Congress. But essentially, from the era when tech hit the classroom, nothing had really changed since the arrival of the steam engine. Interesting, in the corporate world, this term called e-learning appears in about 1998. And that's this concept of how to deliver skills training and learning at scale using the internet, which I think we all experienced it 20, 25 years ago. Was pretty dire. It was PowerPoints or watching a video, very passive stuff. Now, in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion in technology, in sectors, in data, in the cloud, most recently, that's facilitated a massive gold rush in education, technology, and training and digital learning. There's been many false dawns, but there's been a big evolution. And particularly in the last couple of years, there's been a flood of private equity money into education technology. With that, we get a lot of, again, false dawns, but we get some pretty good investments and some developments. And then, as we've discussed already, and it's only been a few minutes in, more than once, that in the last 6 months, we've probably had a bigger shift in the uptake of digital learning, technology and training and education and skills in history. So we've had more change in the last 6 months than we've really had in the last 300 years. So where are we going? The wider education market is developing as it refines what it means to train and teach people at scale and get learning that sticks at scale. It's evolving to a continuous connected learning model, or a lifelong learning, which we'll talk a bit more about today. And that's empowered by the power of processing, the power of computers to run these sort of algorithms and programs, and the speed of data to connect people. So there's this kind of virtuous circle of continual assessment, certification, who I am as a learner growing and developing, and the data engine and lake. These are theoretical concepts recommending things for me to do, which is what happened this year in corporate learning as people went, gosh, I need a new skill, or I desperately need to reskill. Maybe I've lost my job, so I've gone to Udemy or Coursera, etc. What's led the way in these different terms like massive online courses, mobile learning, micro learning, is, again, as I mentioned before, private equity money, and the stock markets have poured money into high valuations into companies who have, some of them are going to fail, but some of them are very, very powerful and have created new ways of getting, the right learning to the right learner, no matter where they are, from the C-suite to the, the very basic manual laborer. And the buzzword here that across all of them is AWATAD, anywhere, anytime, any device. Now, our sector of maritime loves an acronym, so there's a new one for you, AWATAD. And as well as the technological driver to have all these different ways to approach learning and the associated growth, as you can see on these numbers, there's also been a big development in learning science, which is, again, taking a very, pretty much a hard corporate opinion. If we're going to spend all this money on a learning platform, if I'm a bank or an insurance company or a FMCG company or a maritime shipping company, how do I make sure that I get the ROI that I want? How do you measure the effectiveness of learning? Is it purely on a safety and hours lost basis, or is it actually on getting learning that sticks? So there's actually been a huge growth in the science behind learning, social science, of course, and with that, the different modalities and different ways that learning is delivered. This chart here looks at all the different trends and how we're heading, powered by technology and science, to different formats and expanding how to, again, get the right learning to the right learner at the right time, including when they reskill. And it's safe to say that Maritime is moving along. Up to the pandemic, we were probably somewhere around the 2010, 2015 level of maturity. But again, the intelligent learning world that we're approaching is moving fast, and it's been driven by, not instigated or initiated by the pandemic, but it's been accelerated by it. And what we see here is in the digital learning space, here I'm talking specifically about the maritime sector, is we're following a classic timeline. And the timeline is a sort of a fairly well researched and well proven concept, which is digital transformation. And again, it's often a bit cliched and it's been overused, but this is a well proven series of steps that an industry will take when technology emerges and there's early adopters who work out ways to use this technology to try new models, to begin to adapt to new models. So as we often existed in a classroom basis, using classroom and a little bit of online certification to try to, validate or whatever, other people in the industry have been moving much faster. Now, if you think of this timeline with regards to print media, my first job, I was a print journalist. That job doesn't exist anymore. Today, more media and news is consumed via Facebook platforms than in the rest of the world's print media combined. We all know the story of the recording industry and CD-ROMs and where we are now with the Spotify world and broadcast media having been toppled by Netflix, banking and Stripe and PayPal. So it's a question of who's the early adopters and where is the tipping point? And the tipping point is actually where we are today. Here we are towards the end of 2020. We're adjusting to how to survive next year, how to get skills into the right people at the right time when we've got a socially distanced world. And that means connecting people with the cloud, how to get, again, the right skills learning to reduce time to competence, to get people effective, to get people to reskilled and recertified fast using computers, using tablets, using telephones. And the tipping point's where we are. So just to summarize sort of what I've been covering, we're into an era of disruption, and some of it's permanent. Now, that's not to say that we think, and I'm an evangelist of digital learning, I will never say that we'll replace the classroom, we'll never replace the human element. We're there to augment it and there to amplify it, but there is a permanent disruption. The overall technological market and delivery market, supply side of digital learning is projected to be worth $325 billion by 2025, and that's fairly unstoppable. Now, we're dealing with a disruption. We're dealing with an unstoppable momentum of digitization, and the key is, again, we've had 1.8 billion people shift to the cloud to learn, and some will remain there. And how do we know this is going to keep on going? I think it's important to keep a perspective on the where we stand for the internet. What happens next and why is this an inevitability? Again, not trying to overplay the point. Today, we've got around 5 billion internet users, expected to rise to about 5.3 billion. And there's also, the World Economic Forum estimates there's around another 1.3 billion internet users coming online in the next 3 years. And they're primarily from Southeast Asia and Africa. They will be adding to the global data sphere. I'm not sure if anybody's that familiar with zettabytes, I'm not. But it certainly is a measure of the amount of storage that sits around that we'll be accessing through the kinds of things that Johan just showed, but the multiple different other ways that people are going to seek for learning online. It sits in the cloud. And the cloud, again, just to define, the cloud is a place where information is stored, that it's going to be easy to reach. There's clouds that sit within China, which is important if you're going to be delivering training in China. There's multiple geographic sites around the world where data farms sit, where learning can be accessed and where data can be accessed. And there's an interesting perspective on the cloud itself. It used to be a very American-centric technology whereby the US had around more than 80% of the share of cloud storage 10 years ago. A big chunk of that was most probably Amazon. And then Microsoft got into the market as well and other providers. And as we go forward to 2025, you can see again I call the democratization of the internet, that the storage and the access to the internet is far more democratic and far more spread. and speaks again to the key regions for us in maritime, where we're going to see the need to reach more mariners, the younger age, and those that are digital natives, and then to seamlessly, as opposed to my previous part of my presentation, but to seamlessly reach and engage and touch. So that sort of covered my presentation. So it's been really nice to share it with you. And again, that was leading into where Johan was talking of the cloud. And this is, to finish off this slide in front of you, is the engine that powers it. So Neil, back to you, and look forward to some of those questions. I've already had a look at some of them. There's some really good stuff around engaging and learning and online. Thanks, everyone.
Very good. Thank you, James. That was excellent. What we will do is we'll talk a little bit now about smart simulation and cloud-based simulation technology, which I'm very happy to say I'm very grateful that Anglo Eastern and Captain Charla are currently implementing in their organization. I think one of the things that James has highlighted, and actually was going to highlight still further, is the importance of the cloud as part of this change that's taking place. It's a facilitator for actually being able to do all this online learning. And we'll circle back to talk about that a little bit. But Johan, let me hand over to you, and please continue.
All right. Thanks, Neil. Okay, so let's talk a little about our concept, smart simulation. Smart simulation begins with smart marine. As mentioned earlier, Transit became part of Wartsila 2 years ago, and with that has joined an incredible organization with a vision to lead the industry transformation to digitalization and towards what we call then a smart marine ecosystem. And we in the simulation and training team, we have fully embraced this vision, including in our own strategy for simulation solutions, as we look to develop and apply new smart technology for greater collaboration between us and our users, you, and of course also optimization of performance. The smart marine vision can be seen to apply also to maritime training, where effective learning is of course a key component of delivering a high level of safety and sustainability for ports, ship owners, operators, seafarers, and potentially other stakeholders in the maritime industry. So why did we come up with this? Well, simply because the market requests us to. We have maritime standards which cannot keep up with technologies being introduced or the modern ways of transferring knowledge. We are seeing a shift from only focusing on compliance based on safety to a more holistic view looking at performance and sustainability, which requires a more operational, class and even type-specific training. And the other trend we see is the increasing use of simulation for R&D studies. Again, the compliance standards and the real operational competence are not fully aligned, and that needs to be addressed if we are to succeed with closing the competence gap. The digitalization creates a lot of opportunities in the industry, which affects the simulation utilization both for training and R&D applications. I mean, is there one day without a press release about a research project in the field of autonomous or remotely controlled vessels? And many of these projects, if not all, they of course use simulation as a test bed for their projects. The maritime training industry is undergoing a transition to a more modern and agile structure thanks to the digitalization and the connectivity, which allows a greater use of simulated technology. Last but not least, we need global quality standards, but we need to reach local markets, which, for example, doesn't master the English language. Yes, the maritime language is English, but the reality looks a little bit different. And there are shipping sectors which are not covered by SOLAS or the SCCW umbrella. One significant example is, of course, the Chinese inland and river shipping. And we simply don't reach them using maritime English. So we need to localize, we need to adapt. Another reason for doing this is, of course, that our seafarers of tomorrow will learn differently than we do today, and we need to be prepared for that. They are born into a digital world, and more or less integrated with technology. And of course, they expect that technology as a part of their learning process. They will require you to complete most of the training at their own speed, wherever they want, and also individually tailored, and the training must be interactive and evolving rather than passive. And it is critical for the maritime industry that we are adapting to this modern blended learning technologies, which appeals to this generation, because we need to attract them or we will lose them to other industries. Simple as that. So what does this mean in practice? Basically, it means that we are redesigning and adapting our market-leading simulation platform to fit the needs of a digitized maritime industry and the next generation of seafarers. We believe flexibility and scalability will be future key success factors for us. We will be using a singular platform for simulation training, but with the ability to be distributed in a range of mediums to allow efficient blended learning. We have the traditional setups, we have the cloud training environment, but also solutions with virtual and augmented reality and so on in the pipeline. The existing scalability will remain, but it will be further improved with solutions for individual users all the way up to full and multi-mission scenarios with people from all around the world participating in the same virtual environment, the same scenarios. The flexibility will allow the training to take place at any time, at any place and pace, but also with any volume at a given time. So now to the main focus thing at the moment. The pandemic did, of course, drive and push the implementation of our cloud training services, but we were lucky because we had already begun this development when our users suddenly were locked out of the classrooms and simulators. So we put all our efforts, and I really mean all our efforts, to get something out there to support a training industry in chaos, but also wind the mindset to have a viable solution for post-COVID. So the digital transformation was coming anyway, but the pandemic made it accelerate, as James explained earlier. Within 2 months, we launched the first pilot with a number of early adopters who then provided us with the feedback, which is now the base of the release being launched in a couple of weeks. So let's take a look at the instructor-led training, which we have focused on initially. We basically took the physical classroom setup and deployed it up in the cloud. As mentioned before, it's the same platform that is being used in our physical simulators, but with a different delivery method. So the instructor may use the same exercises they already have been using over the years in the standard simulator setup, regardless if it's a bridge or engineering or cargo handling training. You can see the training applications in the two lists here. It's the typical classroom training, and you can argue that, for example, bridge resource management training should be conducted on a full mission simulator. But with the current situation, in most cases, that's just not an alternative. And the cloud simulation infrastructure offers a solid solution during the pandemic, for sure. We, together with some pilot customers, are putting a lot of efforts, Anglo is one of them, to make the cloud simulator design fit for this purpose. So we put a lot of effort into this. So I will run a short video demo here, how the cloud workplace for the instructors and trainee looks like in our solution for navigational training, to give you a little bit of a context, how it works. So any instructor who has experience from a Wartsila transit simulator will instantly recognize the environment. As mentioned before, we're using the same platform, but a different delivery method. The instructor starts the simulated configuration and opens up an existing exercise, or create a new one, and then assign the ownership to the trainee bridge or workplace. This is standard procedure for anyone using a physical simulator, regardless brand. The instructor also have the utility for monitoring the trainee stations. Of course, it's difficult with social distancing to lean over the shoulder. So this tool provides great possibilities to interact and control the trainee workplaces. This is, of course, necessary to be able to demonstrate things to the trainee as a part of the show me concept. The instructor has full control of the trainee workplaces. Another appreciated tool is on the instructor station is the instructor selective view, providing the instructor with the capability to visually monitor what's going out in the scenario. It works exactly the same way as in the physical simulators. You add a camera or several cameras to the exercise either before or during a scenario. And then you control it from the camera control panel, and you can of course show this supporting information like routes, ship names, vectors, etc. Just the way you would have done on your physical simulator. Moving over to the trainee workplace. The left side control panel has the main vessel controls and autopilot, but it also has controls for the echo sounder and log in the bottom. We have the Navisailor Ectus application together with the Naviradar, and also the Navi Planner is there, which then is needed, of course, for the Ectus training, for the chart handling and voyage planning. Switching over to the visual view, the left control panel remains, but we have an area on the right side where we have additional control panels in a multi-page configuration. So you can see the buttons in the lower right part of the visualization. That's where we switch control panel. So just as an example here, we have the visual control allowing us to shift between viewpoints, pan and tilt the visualization. You can see the visuals are running smoothly here, even though it's a video. We're happy to demonstrate this for you. We got the binoculars so that we can observe distant objects, but it also allows us to take bearings, which is of course an important part in many of the different training courses. I don't want to go too deep into details, but the control panels includes the controls and indicators you would expect in a classroom workplace environment for navigational training. So that finishes up the demo, giving at least some understanding of what the instructors and trainees are exposed to during a cloud training session. So for the instructor, a very similar setup compared to a physical simulator. For the trainee, a slightly different design, but with the same capabilities. So that was the basis of the instructor-led training, which has already been rolled out. And the next step is to look at the student-led training for the next release, allowing the students to complete their assignments regardless location or time, or to have the instructor online at the exact same time. That provides flexibility. So this slide shows the basic workflow. The instructor assigns the exercise training package to the trainees. This training package includes the automated scenarios and all the necessary data. The trainee receives then a notification and also details on how to access the cloud workplace virtual machine. And it can also include a time window when the task should be completed. The trainee logs into the cloud workplace, starts and completes the automated training scenario. It could be a fully automated tutorial, or just a free play exercise, or a task-based scenario. And when the assignment has been completed, the training result and data is sent back to the instructor and the record-keeping system. And all these interactions is completed with the training management system in the background, which has all the functionalities required for uploading content, providing access to everyone, instructors and trainees, and stored training records. It also provides the bridge between the simulator and an external learning management system if the customer already has that implemented on their side. As mentioned several times, the transition to digital learning is here. It's not only a COVID-19 response, and we're moving this from a concept to the new reality. As I said, we're using the same simulators that we have in the physical classroom, full mission and part-task bridges, but with a different delivery method. And this fact is the base of the discussion with flag states in regards to STCW course approvals. So in many cases, no new course approval are needed, at least not for the training part. Neil will get back on the assessment part, and that is, of course, where we find challenges, especially on the student-led assessment. And one important note, we have the backing from the class. They see this as a long-term important part of solving the industry's competence and manning gap. And it's great to have their backing, of course, and see their enthusiasm. Finally, we want to understand the blockers that the industry are facing, and together we can address them. Not only the flag state related matters, but it could also be budgetary issues or other admin related matters. So reach out to us with your challenges, and together we can work on how to meet them. Okay, so that finishes up my presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention. Neil, I hand over to you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Johan. Just a reminder for everybody taking part in the webinar, if you have questions, please put them into the GoToWebinar widget, and we'll get to those later on in the session, and we'll have a full Q&A. Okay, now it is time for us to get you guys involved. Time for a poll question. Don't worry, it's multiple choice. You can pick more than one answer, and there's really no wrong answer to this one, so no pressure at all. You know, having seen what we've seen this morning, there are obviously a number of benefits that can be identified related to these new learning technologies. So the question is, which of the following do you see as benefits that the latest learning technologies could bring to you if you're an individual seafarer, or your organization if you're representing a maritime company here? So please go ahead and vote. You can vote right in the GoToWebinar widget, and we'll start racking those up. So yeah, let me just move on here. Okay, so while you're voting, I'll pose this question to Captain Charla, if I may. Anglo Eastern is, I think, recognized as an early adopter of smart technologies. But from your perspective, Pradeep, what do you see as the main benefits of these digital learning technologies? And I guess I pose the question for your organization, and perhaps you can mention that, you know, with your position on a lot of different organizations, maritime organizations. How do you see it as benefiting on a wider scale?
Thanks, Neil. I think for us, the volume of seafarers that we manage is around 29,000 presently. And this technology now actually allows us to do a lot more numbers at a faster rate. So when you're with physical simulators, you're kind of restricted to 8 people at a time. And with this technology, I can see ourselves, you know, running probably 10 classrooms at the same time. And so that is going to be a big benefit. I also see a benefit in travel costs, but more importantly in the convenience for the seafarer that he is able to do these things from home. I do believe that we are in the infancy of all these new technologies, and there will be hiccups along the way as we get on to steady bandwidths in every part of the world, because it's not like you get the last mile of the internet access is often not having sufficient bandwidths. And so I do see this is an unstoppable way of doing training, and it's going to benefit not just Anglo Eastern, but everybody who adopts the technology. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there, everybody, you can see the results of that poll. Travel costs, I think, is tops. But I think, you know, the most interesting thing I see there is the better, faster engagement with younger crews, which I think is so important as we consider that we still have a shortage of officers, and it is quite challenging to attract the youth into the industry. So hopefully some of these things will improve our ability to bring them on board. Very good. So let me, Julia, if you'd like to give me the control here, what I will do. is I will start to share my screen. And so what I'd like to do now, hopefully you can see my screen there, is I will give you a presentation related to what maritime training might look like a little bit in the future. So we've seen what's happening outside of maritime. We've seen what is happening right now inside maritime to try to solve some of these challenges that we have. So you're probably expecting my first slide to be full of images of amazing technologies. So sorry to disappoint on that. But I do think it's important for us to start by thinking about STCW, which is and remains for the foreseeable future the basis of our maritime training. So I'm sure you're all aware, International Chamber of Shipping has called for a comprehensive review of the convention. The intention is to meet current and future demand, and it seems like IMO will begin that formal process soon. Of course, that is COVID willing. The process is obviously a little bit delayed because of the current situation. So you see I've used the 2025 term. It may be 2025, it may be another year for adoption, but it could provide quite a significant change in mariner training. Now, of course, a lot of people are skeptical about that, but we need to take the opportunity to be a part of that process and find solutions that can be universally agreed. It's not easy, but obviously change has happened very quickly in the recent past, and perhaps that will actually change a number of attitudes as well. So, yeah, as I said, STCW continues to provide a set of internationally recognized standards for training and certification of seafarers. The objectives, as stated or requested by industry, are to update seafarer competencies, remove the outdated requirements in the conventions, address the expanding competence gap between competence achieved under our current training guidelines and what a seafarer actually needs to operate the vessel. In addition, the objective is to ensure that STCW can allow us to adapt to allow for the increasing pace of technological change, and obviously that's what we're talking about a lot today. Increased operational focus, more about the operation of the vessel. We've obviously been through generations where the focus has been safety and environment, and that remains of utmost importance, of course, but operational focus is really a new part now for this. And these aren't my suggestions, these are the objectives set by industry. Last one there, harmonized and consistent implementation. And I think really the main driver there is to ensure that this continues to be a standard that can be used around the world. So if we achieve this in whole or part over the next, say, 5 years to define, and then probably 3 to 5 years to actually implement, we're taking a very big step in the right direction. And we would then have a firm foundation to build upon for some of the things I'm going to talk about in the forthcoming slides. And we might have a new look STCW, which allows for more frequent changes and updates to keep pace with the technology that we have. So the second point I want to make is that maritime training is without question going digital. Yes, as James indicated, maritime training can be considered to be perhaps well behind the leading edge of the learning technologies. So there's plenty of room to increase utilization and learn from parallels within similar industries. Yes, the pandemic has already rapidly increased the adoption of online learning and assessment as well. To some extent, this is simply because we don't have any other option. But every challenge comes an opportunity to rethink how we do things and hopefully create a new normal. We've seen a fairly radical and positive shift by flagged states regarding their position on approval of blended and online courses, which is fantastic. And at the same time, I think it is important, because we'll talk a lot about technology, but it's very important that we ensure that the training standards are not compromised or that shortcuts are taken. So, you know, there is potential at a time like this for low quality technology to be accepted as a quick fix. And we really don't want to set precedents now that would be hard to roll back when all this is said and done, and we do reach that new normal. So the right technology, if applied in the right way, can and will increase the efficiency of training and reduce its costs. Gathering seafarers for training as we do, or as we did in the past, flying them halfway around the world, it is obviously inherently inefficient. Technology that allows for blended learning reduces costs, and official statistics are that around 20 to 30% cost reductions can be achieved by using more blended learning. And that's not switching everything to online learning. That's not the suggestion, but a more practical approach using blended learning will provide those big numbers. So whether or not your training budgets are expanding or contracting, imagine having 20 or 30% more budget to invest in technologies and the things that are probably, you know, listed as priorities for the last few years. So this is, I think it's important as well here that it really is a win for everybody. Seafarers, shipping companies, and the marine training institutes benefit from those cost savings, which allows more funds for investment and to drive the changes we need in the coming years. Once these things are implemented and we prove the effectiveness, obviously these online training trends will be hard to reverse, and modern technologies can actually retain the traditional teaching methods like coaching and mentoring, particularly when you use things like virtual reality, which actually puts you together in to some extent physically inside a virtual operating space. And I think the last thing is to not forget how positive this reduction in travel can be for the environment. So a lot of discussion, of course, about autonomy. Not a day passes without some new digitalization and autonomous release in the maritime news. The move towards autonomy is likely to cause a series of disruptive changes to maritime operations, particularly on the bridge. And these could significantly change maritime competence and training requirements, and that will really be for the first time in decades that that's happened. The pace of these changes, it's very hard to predict, and there are, of course, many steps between where we are today and autonomy, should we reach that point at some stage in the future. So I think that's one of the important things to think about when we are trying to look at what's going to be needed in the future, is not to think only of autonomy, because it is a certain distance away. There are a lot of steps in between that need to be addressed. So that said, the first changes are already or have already happened. So connected ships means that interactions with shoreside systems and personnel, they're now significantly more frequent. Fleet operations centers are taking a monitoring and supporting role during normal operations, and their heightened involvement if there were to be an incident. On board the bridge and shipboard, resource management has become more of a cross-organizational type fleet operations resource management with that involvement from ashore. And as I mentioned, operational efficiency is a massive driving force and is really a competitive need. So it's something that the mariner is now really being trained to actually consider, along with safety and, of course, the environment. So we already need to adapt some of the training and learning we have now to keep up with these technological changes as digitalization and more automation aboard changes the competence needs of the seafarer. Decision support and AI in shipboard navigation equipment, it really isn't far away, it's coming. Intelligence built into the navigation systems will allow them to think, see, and calculate best maneuvers further into the future than any navigator can. It's just the reality of it. The question is, how will we change our procedures and training to ensure mariners are actually using this technology effectively and safely? And you know, obviously, very importantly, as it is for any technology, it is so critical for us to identify the limitations and make sure that everybody understands what they are, particularly as we transition. So although we all have opinions as to how long it's going to take, I think we all accept that autonomous vessels aren't far away. Probably smaller craft first. We know that navies around the world are heavily moving in this direction. Defense vessels involved in repetitive coastal operations, offshore wind farms. There are real projects happening right now that will bring some level of autonomy in those operations. So the regulations have to adapt, and we'll have new maritime traffic situations to deal with as well. So imagine for a moment your first encounter as a watchkeeper with an autonomous vessel. Would you think of it just as another vessel, or would you consider it in a wholly different way than one that actually has a watchkeeping officer up on the bridge? It's an interesting thing to start to think about. So before we reach any large scale of autonomy, there are all these steps in between. We are likely to move to an active human in the loop type situation, which triggers further significant changes to the operations. And this is interesting because it is actually predicted by people in industry that this is likely to happen within the next 10 years. So that's within the current STCW cycle. So these are actually things, as far away as they may seem, we probably need to be thinking about them now. And if active human in the loop is successful, the next step is that we're likely to see navigators operating in a more supervisory role, with maneuvering in traffic becoming a lot more automated. And, you know, if these are fairly radical things to be thinking about, this is all before we even really get to considering where to begin in identifying the competence and training requirements for remote and then fully autonomous operations. I think what I will say about that is, you know, it is really interesting. Some of the leading training providers are already beginning to think about mapping out these learning futures for each step in this process towards autonomy, which is a great thing to start to think about that now. Third point, maritime training could follow the trends of similar industries. Now, I deal quite a lot with delivering training solutions for naval customers as well, and there's a lot of differences. I'll be the first to point out that naval training has plenty of its own challenges, but it's always good to make a comparison, and I simply have to do that because it's part of the work that I do. But it can be quite interesting, and there are certainly parallels and similarities. I brought up on the screen there operational readiness. This really is the first rule of naval training. It's about preparing to be operationally ready in every possible way for that particular vessel. Isn't this where commercial maritime seems to be going, right? In an ideal world, a mariner is operationally ready before you've even set foot on the vessel. You have the opportunity to actually learn a certain amount before you get there. Of course, we don't have in commercial operations the financial luxury of a naval budget, and that's really, I think, the main thing that stops this from happening. If we had an abundance of available cash, we could do that more and extract these types of best practices to make us more effective. But certainly, training begins with clearly defined and understood training needs via analysis. On the military side, they invest huge amounts up front in determining very clearly what their training needs are. As is increasingly the case in commercial training in the naval side, it very much fits a mold of basic officer and rating training is theoretical and generic, which is really where ours is going more and more. That allows you to learn the fundamentals, and then qualified officer training has a much higher proportion of vessel class and type-specific content. Each class of vessel then tends to have a set of training materials associated with those particular vessels. And again, we can see that that is the way things are going in our part of the industry too. And more importantly, getting back to the theme of the technology, in the naval and defense and military side, there is a already extensive use of virtual and augmented realities and those types of technologies. So perhaps commercial maritime could take on some elements of this model in the future. Last one I want to talk about then really references back to what James was talking about. And it is, it's an interesting thing for me being involved in maritime, but part also of a wider corporate learning and development business. Maritime isn't an island, especially in the more connected world that we're in. We often talk of the ship becoming an extension of the office, and that connection is only growing on a daily basis. So I think it's safe to suggest that we could well change the way we're doing training in a similar manner to that of the wider corporate learning and development world. James referenced this before. This starts with lifelong learning, right? It's a change of approach to building learning into really the everyday operation and everyday seafarers' lives. The pace of technology in our industry and the automation that we're experiencing, it simply creates a need for upskilling and continuous learning throughout your career. So there are some interesting numbers that are put out, which is that about 70% of what you learn is through experience, 20% is learned from your peers, and then only 10% is really from the formal instruction. So I think, in maritime, again, we've always felt the importance of the sea time and the experiences on the vessel, and those figures prove that. But really, we need to pump more training into those experiences and ensure that those experiences are giving the learning outcomes that we need. Spaced learning is the next one, another good buzzword from the corporate learning world. Spaced learning with practice is proven to be far more effective means of learning and results in a lot better retention. So what is it? Spaced learning is effectively what it sounds like. It's spreading out learning over a longer period of time, but doing it in such a way that you learn, practice, and you increase your retention rather than being sat in a classroom. So compressing our learning into these intensive training periods of a 40-hour course in a classroom, it's proven to not be the most effective way to do it. So learning is, in fact, becoming a continuous journey, or let's call it a voyage, through your career. And during that, we will more and more track the activities and the history and the credentials so that we can then actually target training and adapt that training for the individual rather than the group. So thinking of it from a technology perspective a little bit here, the first thing to point out is that we're now really thinking about learning experience platforms. So we've talked, I think everyone's familiar with learning management systems, but now these learning management systems are adapting to really be the home of where all your learning experiences take place. So this will become the norm as learning becomes a part of those everyday operations. AI will be used to personalize and customize learning. More and more learning will be on demand. That's what the young seafarer will want, as Johan referenced, and they want to do it where it suits them best. So I think one of the other important things about this is that it really means taking the training to the trainee, not expecting the trainee to come to do the training in a particular place. So for those of you who might be thinking this all contradicts our traditions in maritime training, fear not, because in many ways, I think some of the things discussed here, they only serve to reinforce the importance of our sea time, the experiences at sea, but it does mean applying the technology in the right way to ensure competence, safety, environmental awareness, and operational readiness. James mentioned to us separately the experience in the corporate learning and development world, and he touched on it in his presentation, that the first years of that e-learning process was a lot of videos, CBT, not very engaging for people, and frankly it was a bit of a turn-off. So we've got to, again, embrace the technologies that make it a more interesting experience for the seafarers. I always like to suggest to people, and it's very true, the experiences I remember from my cadetship are the simulation time. I can remember them as if it was yesterday, and that's quite a long time ago. And I think, I remember vividly the first time that I've used virtual reality. So those technologies will help to ensure the retention that we need. So this next generation of seafarers, they want collaborative learning. They don't want to just sit in front of a computer doing it on their own. They want to be engaged with an instructor. They want to be engaged with peers, and they want to do things as a group. So, we can use immersive virtual reality environments with groups of users all around the world to extend the benefits of mentoring and coaching by putting people in that environment together. So last but not least, there is a trend in corporate L&D to actually put the assessments online as well. And of course, this is quite challenging because there is always the opportunity or the potential for cheating. It certainly seems to be greater in a situation where you're not physically located with the person being assessed. But there are some very interesting and very capable new technologies that allow for detailed visual and audio monitoring of those students being assessed. And it can do things like tagging a recording so that you can pick out any eye movements or sound cues or other people in the room, things like that, for an experienced proctor. So the corporate world is already dealing with those problems, and we can actually take advantage of that and utilize some of those experiences to perhaps implement within our industry. So plenty to think about there. These are a few of our ideas. Some obviously to stimulate some thought during this webinar. Could be some of the places where maritime training is going. But we're really happy and enthusiastic to use this forum that's graciously provided by the Nautical Institute to hear your ideas, opinions and questions. So David has been monitoring the incoming questions. I'm sure there are plenty. So David, if I can ask you to perhaps raise them to some of the panel, and I will stress the importance of giving me and Captain Charlotte the easy ones, and the difficult and complex questions should be addressed to Johan and James, if you could.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil, and thanks to all the presenters for a really thorough presentation. We do have an awful lot of questions have come in, but I'm pleased to say that most of you, or a lot of them, will have been answered in the presentations themselves. And there's a lot of appreciation, James, for your demonstration of infrastructure needs. And what happens when you lose it. So thank you. Right. On that note, so there were some cheeky comments, but also some realistic ones about infrastructure. Pradeep, you've been using remote training for a while. How much of it is a challenge for your seafarers ashore, and do you actually use this on board your ships?
For the people ashore, I think the kind of teachers that are required for anything to do with technology-led training is slightly different from people from the generation that I would like to say I don't belong to. And it's there is a learning process here for the teachers, because some of them were only comfortable with chalk and board, and moving over to classroom based from classroom based training to simulation was a challenge for some of them. And similarly, the change from class simulations in the hardware world to cloud simulation is going to be a challenge for some of them. I think the one single quality that we look for with our teachers is ability to constantly adopt to change. And I'm lucky to have a good team in Anglo Eastern who's been doing that. So the journey has been pretty smooth to what we are doing now. When it comes to onboard training, I think we are on the cusp of launching our virtual reality based training for keeping it even on the ships. It's from a point of view of technology, it's not probably as amazing as what some industries are using, but we are on Oculus Quest classes and we are doing certain things now in VR on board the ships too. And I think it's a constantly evolving part, and every teacher just needs to either adopt, or they will, like everything else in the world, they would become obsolete. It's not that only younger people can adopt it. In fact, I've had some great successes with the senior most teachers wanting to adopt it because it suddenly ignites their willingness to learn new stuff. So that would be my answer to your question.
Okay, thanks. And what about, we got a question here from Malik, who's talking about the IT infrastructure being able to cope, and another comment from Urin about poor internet access in the Philippines. Are you finding the physical infrastructure itself a challenge? Because I suppose we're not the only industry going this way. A lot of the other industries are going to want to eat up some of that bandwidth as well. James,
Yeah.
what's your experience?
So we find that the best the best ways when we approach content creation is no different, and Jan can speak to our simulation and cloud, is to use the best in technology so we aren't completely reliant on good broadband. A good distance learning should take an assumption of who's the user and what's their average availability on their phone. That means not necessarily running full video. It means the ability to potentially download documents and to stream, etc. I know from our perspective in the future of our cloud, we're looking at a fairly, we want a stable connection, but not a huge pipe. Is that right, Johan?
Yeah, I mean, what we are using at this moment is the Amazon cloud services, and our requirements for a full visual application is around 3 to 5 megabit per second, and that is the initial requirements we have, because we haven't really done full piloting on this. So it might be that we can lower this requirement, or recommendation, I would say, at this stage. But those demos we have done, are very few issues with the speed. Of course, if the connection is broken, it's broken. It's no dead reckoning in this world, that's for sure. So a stable internet connection is required. The speed is not very, very important. Let's say like that. Yeah.
I would add on that too, that by using Amazon Web Services, Amazon have poured tremendous amounts of money into their infrastructure in most countries in the world. So from that perspective, we know that the virtual machine side is very stable and very solid. And we can actually locate the classrooms in various parts of the world. So we're not asking anyone in the Philippines, for example, to connect to a server in Europe somewhere, which would just add to the potential problem. And I think the other thing as well is we're building into this some utilities and capabilities to avoid disruption, because we know there will be breakdowns in the link, as we saw with James this morning. It will happen, but the simulation continues, and it's actually quite easy to then reconnect when you get back. So all those things can be done. The simulator has features like it does in the physical classroom, where you can rewind and you can restart from certain positions. So there will be certain annoyances from that, but we'll obviously work with the technology to try to make it as easy for the users and the instructors as possible.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, it is interesting because at the Nautical Institute, we teach some short courses, and there were classroom courses before the pandemic, and we've had to adapt them all. And we were very concerned about bandwidth, but I must say that in general, we haven't had too much problem. And that includes places like the Philippines and, across the Indian subcontinent. So I think it is a reality, yes, as James proved, that there are going to be hiccups along the way. But I think generally the infrastructure will support it and keep getting better.
Yeah.
Pretty one for you. This is Jill. Will this mean the end of the smaller and poorer training establishments that don't have the equipment to provide e-training? So maybe this is one with your Global Met hat on. How is this technology going to impact the smaller training schools?
Yeah, hi Joe. I don't think it will take away anything from the smaller institutes. I would say it actually gives them more ability to compete with the bigger ones, because now you could hire the cloud simulation from these guys, and I'll take a commission on that recommendation, Neil. Truly, it's a fact that it allows you. So, I mean, typically we were spending a very large sum of money with companies like Wartsila, etc. And it was difficult for smaller companies to do that. But with this kind of technology becoming available, I think it's going to get it's the bigger institutes that are going to lose business to smaller ones, in my opinion. Thank you.
That's an interesting point, because one of the questions, and I forget who asked it just offhand, was what's going to happen to the very expensive simulators that are in situ and not being used. Neil.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pradeep's, he's right on that, but I would say it's those that adapt. Those that don't adapt to the changes that are taking place will find it much more difficult to compete. So adaptation is the first stage there, and the big schools can do that. In fact, the big schools are very well situated for that. I can say that so far, the early adopters for our cloud simulation is quite an interesting cross-section of the whole maritime training industry. It is shipping companies, it's some small providers, it's maritime academies, it's a little bit of everything. So that's why I feel those that get it and realize that it can solve some problems for them can answer that. With regard to the big simulators, again, it's all part of the different pieces of learning for seafarers. Onboard experience is critical. Being put into a physical simulator with others remains critical. I think what the cloud can do is it can actually replace quite a lot of classroom training, because if you think about it, really, the users are typically on a single PC, right, or a laptop with a single screen. So there's a limited amount you can do with that. Now, if we all end up having our own Oculus Rift sitting next to our TV and our Xbox and everything else in the future, then you're able to potentially use that to provide a more immersive group type environment. But I don't honestly see too much of a change, because the full mission bridge environment is so immersive and gives you that that feeling and puts the pressure on you in the right type of way.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and
Bill.
just to comment on the classroom here, that the cloud simulation will replace a lot of the classroom training. Yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be co-located even if you're using the cloud simulation. It's just a matter of where you're located. But if you have a generic classroom with generic internet connected workstations, then of course you can connect up the cloud simulation to do that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do everything from home or something. Co-location will still be required for some parts of the training.
Okay, and James, you touched on any device, anytime, and Neil touched on it as well. Are there minimum standards for the equipment that students are going to have? Can they use a mobile phone?
I think any good learning designs to be especially both prescribed learning that's pushed out to the learner, or also learning available to a crew member if they can access a library, needs to be able to function on a basic mobile phone connection, even if that means potentially downloading some documents for offline reading. But essentially, the youngest generation coming into the workforce do expect an anywhere, anytime, any device mode. Again, even if that's an offline mode or the ability to clunk onto a Wi-Fi. So we should be thoughtful when designing digital learning, that it can be, I always visualize somebody sitting on a dock or something with a phone in their hand. So I'm, the design of learning is always about the end result, which is the reducing time to competence and boosting skills. We have to recognize that there's billions of people, and this is their communication tool, and they've never actually used the keypad to dial. It's WhatsApp is how they chat, social messaging, and documents and streaming. So we have to realize that's the adaptation required.
Okay, thanks. I do have my eye on the time, and I'm going to try to end fairly promptly, but there's a lot of human element questions here. So we all have and have been touched by fantastic trainers, teachers. We learn an awful lot in the debrief afterwards. So here's just one question that Prani sent in. Will there be new skills required of the maritime trainer? Pradeep, you have trainers. Have they had to develop new skills, and do they lose that personal touch?
I think I'm a believer that everything happens incrementally, slowly. The change to technology will happen, but we must never forget that even for the technology to work well, there will always be human beings involved in it. So while the trainer in this case may not be physically in the same space, he is pretty much attending to the needs of the trainer. And even if it's like us conversing today, looking at each other. I mean, it doesn't really mean that we're not getting across what we would do sitting in the same room. We may not have a beer with us at the same time, but rest of it can work. So I don't think that that's really something that is going to cause a problem on losing the human touch out there. It's more important is that, does the teacher have the passion to do the training, and whether that is now online or whether it is in the classroom, that's what defines a good teacher. Not the technology, not the lesson plan. It's how you deliver and with what passion do you inspire people, because we never really teach anyone anything. We inspire people to be lifelong learners. That's what the great teachers are.
And do you see that there will be a less of a market for trainers because they're able to reach out to more students, or is there going to be a greater need for them because they have more training to do?
My guess is that it will be more training jobs in the world with digital technology, because there is only that much that, say, a company like us can achieve with 29,000 seafarers with brick and mortar classrooms. I cannot increase the number of classrooms from 10 to 20 if I need them. And a typical case in our industry would be a company has an incident and they would like to reach out to all 29,000 people as quickly as possible to teach them the learnings from that incident. That would not be possible in a brick and mortar situation. But give me the same incident to replay on cloud simulation, I can reach out to all of them within a couple of months then.
Oh, that's a fantastic argument. Neil, I suppose this goes back to your space training. Are you seeing companies embrace this sort of strategy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's an interesting point on the, the replaying of data in the simulators too, because that is something that you can do now, particularly with our fleet operations solutions. And again, Anglo Eastern being an early adopter of that, the capability is there. And as he says, it's tough to implement such a thing in a bricks and mortar type environment. But it's something that within a matter of a few minutes even, you can get the data from the ship, you can take a timestamp, you can then put it into the simulator, run it, analyze it over a period of probably a few days, turn it into a learning experience, and actually put it up there onto a learning management system, assign it to X number of captains or whoever, officers, and it's done, and you've automated the process a little bit there. So yeah, I think a lot of this period of time here, I think, has made a lot of organizations have to rethink and come up with some new strategies to keep the business going in the short term, and then understand what won't change back to how it was, and really move forward and turn it into a new business for them.
Thanks, Neil. Number of questions on assessments. Now, in your system, do the students get assessed by the computer? Do they get assessed by an instructor? Is there a balance, a blend?
Yeah, assessment is a bigger question. I think we first have to really embrace the learning online for the learning part of the course. The assessment is obviously a touchy area, and we don't want to assess people if we're not achieving the same as we would physically. So what our challenge is to make sure that the technologies are there to be able to correctly assess people, on simulators in the cloud or in other ways. But James, I know you've got some experience with some of these proctoring type technologies in the wider learning world. Do you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, so firstly, just on a philosophical perspective, on an andragogical perspective, which is the teaching of adults, assessment is in itself a learning tool. It's a teaching tool, and that's sort of a slightly different way of thinking as opposed to assessments like pass or fail, yes or no test. There is both pretty basic and then all quite advanced technology that enables assessment to be invigilated or proctored, and then again that runs through either it's a bit time consuming, but you can actually video record an accessible exercise, and that can be reviewed by one invigilator who can do multiple jobs. This is how you can assess wide disparate geographic groups without being in a room if the classroom is distanced or closed. And then there's more advanced AI widgets and programs out there which are actually quite clever. They'll actually assess the room.
Uh-oh.
I think he's trying to prove his earlier point again.
He freezes in the best possible positions like that. Okay.
So, Neil, do you want to pick up on that thread of assessment technology?
Yeah, it's the technology is there. I think to try and answer it quickly, because we can talk a lot about that particular subject. The important thing is that the assessors are comfortable that they are able to do the assessments in the right way. I would see it as some of the the less important assessments are what we need to do first. We're not suggesting, people going up for their major certification, can instantly now switch all the assessments to that. But it is something that can be done. The technology is there. So as an industry, we need to get some experience, learn, make sure we're all comfortable and able to use it in the right way to ensure that assessments are done effectively.
Thanks, Neil. And I see we've just gone over time a little bit, but there's one question that I think is very important. Are we looking for at a societal shift where people, if they're learning from their homes rather than classrooms, the long-term effect of that isolated learning is that going to be a problem? Pradeep, do you have a thought of that?
To me, I don't think any one methodology is ever going to take over everything in the near future. And I think the teacher has to decide that for a particular learning outcome, what's the best strategy in how to design the lesson plan. So if you want to do something that is learned better through peer discussions, then it has to be in a classroom. Now, whether that classroom remains a brick and mortar or it remains a platform like this one, I think there the jury is out, because it may not make that much of a difference. But there is also a lot of learning that goes in place outside of the classroom when you get people together in a room. It's the evening together afterwards, it's the interaction in the coffee break. Even that contributes a lot about shared values, if not shared knowledge. And shared values is extremely important, because that's what kind of then helps towards building up the corporate or a company culture. So I'm not a believer that we are going to go everything online in the next 25 years, my time horizon, I guess. But it's certainly going to be more part of the pie of training is going to be with remote stuff, and but the reduction is not going to be dramatic over the next 25 years. I would say probably another 15% of whatever we do in training world will go over to doing things from home or remote learning or self-learning, but a lot of it is still going to remain sensible to bring people together.
Okay, thanks, Pradeep. And I think we'll end on that note. I will remind everybody that you have about a minute to download those slides if you haven't already. They are available in the handout section. I'd like to thank Neil and Johan and Pradeep and James. Thank you for your time. It's been a huge, not only the last hour and a half, but for the last couple of weeks, I know you guys have been working really hard to get your ideas across, to share them with our audience. So thank you very much for all that effort. Fantastic stuff. Okay.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to do it, David, and the Nautical Institute. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And also thanks to Julia for being in the background and making sure that we behave.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Thank you very much. And we are at the Nautical Institute, a membership organization. So here's the shameless plug. Join us for this conversation. We learn by sharing. So come and share with us, help us learn, and get the best out of this wonderful new technology. So I will invite all the presenters to log off, and then I will close the system down. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.